It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Farmers descend on Westminster to express their anger at recent changes to inheritance tax on farms.
How bad could this be for farmers, Jeremy?
It's the end. If you actually stop and pay attention, it's the end.
The vast majority of farms will not be affected by these changes to inheritance tax, but it's only right we ask the very wealthiest to pay their fair share.
So who's right? Also on the programme,
we will set up Great British Energy. This is a publicly owned energy company that will ensure that we have renewable energy, which is cheaper, so bills will be down permanently.
But as snow arrives in Britain, bills look set to go up. The government says the NHS must reform or die. A senior advisor to Wes Streeting says this is why.
The amount of care that is going to be necessary in the next 10 to 15 years with an ageing and sicker population will overwhelm the current model of the National Health Service.
Joining us today, Labour MP Jim Dixon, Conservative MP Ben Spencer, Liberal Democrat MP Jess Brown-Fuller and Alex Phillips of Talk TV. This is Politics Live. Well, as you heard in the headlines, the protest of thousands of farmers continues. They've descended on Westminster all morning to lobby their MPs about changes to inheritance tax. But I want to show you this warning in BBC News headline following a letter from supermarkets and large retailers warning retail job cuts inevitable after the budget. The letter has gone to the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, to say that a £7 billion increase in annual costs after last month's budget would lead to job cuts and higher prices, talking about the increase in national insurance contributions on employers and the rise in the national minimum wage. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Alex, are there ever taxes you can raise without getting the kind of criticism the government is getting following the budget?
Well, look, I think if people think things are done proportionately, I think if things are perceived to be done in a way that's even-handed, in a way that has some sort of outlook for economic growth, then, of course, people don't like taxes. There's always going to be a subset of people who complain about a specific tax. But I think what we've seen here is a massive overspend, getting out the scattergun of ideological policy in the first 3 months. Now they've got a massive bill they've got to pay, and they're raiding the big employers, they're raiding the small employers. It's a tax on work. That, to me, is absolutely insane. Why would you do that when you want to push for economic growth? This headline is inevitable.
Do you think there are other taxes, though, that they could have raised on the basis of filling what they say, Labour, is a black hole without this sort of criticism?
Well, there are two ways, aren't there, to raise revenue for a country. There's the growth strategy, where you try and essentially grow your economy by actually generating more industry. And through doing that, you deregulate and you actually tax cut. Then you've got actually bringing in revenue through direct taxation. In terms of what they should have gone for, look, I'm not an economist. It's not my job to be the Chancellor and lay out some sort of programme. I think what they have done is broken all of their manifesto pledges and they're hitting the economy hard. What they should have done before they rolled out a whole tranche of other policies is think, how can we afford them? They haven't done that. They don't know what they're doing. And
I'll come to you, Jim, in just a moment. But first of all, Jess, are there any taxes that you can suggest that you can raise to bring in revenue to the Treasury without getting the sort of criticism that the government's getting?
Absolutely. And we laid out some of those in the Liberal Democrat manifesto during the general election. So we would reverse the Conservative tax cuts on the big banks. We would increase the taxes on the oil and gas giants. There are, like Alex said, many different ways that you can raise.
Oh, you can raise money, but would you still get the sort of criticism? Because in the end, anybody that pays higher taxes, it can come down in terms of pension funds or consumer prices. It's not pain-free.
I don't think that a tax on the big banks who are earning incredible profits would be unpopular with the electorate. I think they'd rather see that than what we've seen here, which is a jobs tax.
Ben, are there taxes that you can raise without getting criticised?
Well, firstly, I think it's sadly wholly unsurprising that we've had this statement regarding the impact of raising national insurers' contributions. You don't have to have formal economic experience to know that if you put costs on businesses, that's going to be passed on in some other way, shape or form. But I think it's important to look at the framing of this budget. Labour have made decisions to throw a lot of money around and to have huge spending increases.
Are you talking about settling the strikes and paying public sector workers?
Settling strikes, huge amounts of investment and spending in a whole different bunch of areas. Decisions have consequences. That money's got to come from somewhere. During the election, we boxed them into a corner in terms of committing not to raise national insurance, not to raise VAT, not to raise income tax. They committed to that, but what that meant is clearly they had plans all along to effectively tax and spend. And so they've been boxed in having to produce these very destructive, from a productivity and from a growth perspective, taxation going forward. And what I wish is they'd just been honest during the election. This was their plan, and they hadn't committed to these big free tax pauses as we did.
Right. Answer that question on the dishonesty that Ben is saying was levelled by Labour during that election campaign by saying you wouldn't raise taxes broadly.
We were brought in with a very specific mandate to sort out public services, our NHS, our schools, to fix the public finances, which were an absolutely dreadful mess, the £22 billion black hole. I think it bears repeating because that was the size of the problem, and that we had a very specific mandate to do that without raising taxes on working people, so nobody's pay slip has been affected as a result of this budget. Smaller businesses have been protected. That's very important because that's people on often low incomes working very hard. And it was very clear, we always said that taxes needed to be levied on those with the broadest shoulders and those best able to bear it. And I believe that's what we've done. I believe it's broadly popular. I note that 2 out of the 3 people round the table haven't really answered the question about how they would raise taxes yet. They seem to want all the extra investment in things like the NHS, schools, roads, our justice system. And that's what we're delivering, and I think that's really important.
Well, that's true, isn't it? You could read the mandate that the government won, the Labour government won, as a mandate to fix public services. Broken, one might argue, by the previous Conservative administrations.
So to governors to choose. The Labour government's making some decisions, and I think it's very important that they own those decisions. I note that Jim repeated the 22 billion black hole fallacy. If you look at the OBR, that's been well and truly debunked.
Well, they agreed to 9 billion. They say there was 9 billion.
But sure, but it just bears repeating that the OBR has found no evidence for these statements. What we've seen instead is whacking pay handouts to various unions, decisions in terms of 22 billion towards the NHS, which Lord Darcy's report itself says you don't fix an NHS by throwing more money at it. So I think it's important that we lay these decisions very clearly on the Labour government.
All right, well, let's talk about the farming protest because, as I say, it's been going on all morning. We may be able to show you some of the images of both farmers and tractors as they descended on Westminster, mainly to lobby their MPs. There they are, gathered down Whitehall, about these changes to inheritance tax. There has been an exemption up until now on agricultural estates, but those changes that are being brought in by the government will mean that estates over £1 million will be charged 20% of inheritance tax broadly. There are exemptions. Let's go over to our BBC colleague Martine Croxall. She's been with the farmers all morning in Westminster. Martine, what's it been like?
There are a great deal of very angry people here today who've come up from all over the country. The countryside has come to the capital in their thousands, and they've set up just outside Downing Street to voice their concerns about the change to these inheritance tax rules. And I'm joined by 2 young farmers who've come from the East Midlands, Katie Truman, who works on a farm in Derbyshire, and Maddie Bunting, whose family farm in Nottinghamshire. Maddie, you're obviously now having to have conversations as a family. What are you discussing and how concerned are you?
Very concerned. This will be the downfall of British agriculture if we carry on this way. You keep pushing us and incentivising us not to farm. You put it all over the supermarkets, British farming, and where is it?
Katie, you work for a farming family, so how would it, do you think, affect your job prospects if these changes do go through as the government plans?
Well, I work for a small family dairy farm in the Derbyshire Hills, which obviously the minimum wage is being put up. The milk price is very inconsistent anyway, so we never know quite how much we're going to get for what we produce. So that's obviously fluctuating all the time anyway. But with then the extra added tax, it's even more uncertain what's going to happen to ourselves and our neighbouring small farms.
Maddie, the government says that in actual fact there will be probably 75% of farms won't be at all affected. It isn't £1 million, it's more like £3 million.
Absolutely ridiculous. They do not have a clue what they're going on about.
So has your family taken tax advice on how you'll be affected?
You don't need to think to be. I understand where they're coming from with this rule, but it's capped too low. You're not bothering the people that actually need to be stopped, like Dyson, let's say. They're doing it to, well, we know what they're doing it for, don't they? You're not supporting the actual farmers that are getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning in the wet clothes, being paid less than minimum wage. A lot of us young people especially, we don't get paid minimum wage because it's our belief that we get the farm. Well, we're not going to get the farm, we're not going to have a future. This will ruin us.
There is an argument that the government's put forward that there is a black hole in public finances, that all parts of society, all sectors of the economy need to help fill that gap. Why should farming be an exception?
Farmers obviously produce an awful lot for every single person in the country. We are slammed in a lot of other ways like other people are. You know, your regular NHS workers, your, professional sports people and stuff like that. We are slammed in the exact same way. But we're the hard-working ones that provide for everybody, so why should we then have to pay more to then contribute nothing to us anyway? We don't get anything out of paying more taxes, so why would we be slammed for it?
Let Gary Lineker pay. We don't need to talk about that.
The people aren't seeing it. The everyday public aren't seeing it the same as we are. That inheritance tax, it's all right people saying, oh, but we get taxed, why aren't you? That's absolutely ridiculous. You're not getting taxed on your job. You're not getting taxed. You've already got your home, and then you've got your parents' house that they're being gifted you. You're getting taxed on that. That is our business. That is our livelihood. You're taxing us on.
What impact is it likely to have, do you think, Katie, on what farmers will invest in their farms? Because the investment becomes part of that tax liability, doesn't it? If you buy a new tractor, if you buy a new combine harvester.
Yeah. Obviously, a lot of people, some bigger farmers, not necessarily the farm that I work on, like to, keep the machinery rolling. They have it on a 3-year package, a 5-year package, anything like that. That's obviously becoming more and more unrealistic with obviously them running older kit. If it's not serviced and maintained properly, you become more problems. So that's just then another problem that involves money. Everything's obviously getting more expensive anyway, labour, parts, obviously having to ship them in from other countries. Everything is now just a pit of money, and everyone that doesn't farm seems to think that farmers have an endless pit of money, which obviously is not true.
We're asset poor, cash rich. We don't have it in the bank.
The other way round, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. I knew what you meant. Yeah.
We don't have it in the bank. We can still pay wages. You have it in the fields, but you need the fields to farm. You sell your fields, you've not got anything to make any money.
Maddie, Katie, thank you very much. We'll let you carry on joining the protest. As you can hear, a great deal of concern about the implications that these changes are going to have. But the government maintains, Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, saying that he's going to keep making the point and explaining the figures to try to quell some of these concerns.
Martine Croxall, thank you very much. The anger is palpable there with those two women that Martine was talking to. We can just show you some pictures of the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, there on stage addressing the crowd, obviously also against these changes to inheritance tax on agricultural farms. Can I just get a response from you, Jim? I mean, let me just give you some of the quotes there. The downfall of British agriculture. The changes are going to be an incentive not to farm. We're not going to have a future. What do you say?
Well, I think today is a good day for democracy because I think, the Labour government has introduced taken away agricultural property relief and reduced it so that it's now half the rate that people would normally pay inheriting assets. I think we need to understand that it doesn't just affect people who have assets over £1 million. It's likely that anyone with assets up to £3 million will also get relief if it's a husband and wife. And for instance, if a farm owned by a husband and wife is worth 3.2 million.
So you just dismissed you're dismissing what you've just heard about the real fear. You can hear it, and anger. We can get into the figures in a moment, but just generally they feel, a lot of farming communities, as if they've been under attack from this government with those changes.
I really don't believe that's true, and if you talk to people in rural communities, their concerns are very similar to the rest of the country: the cost of living, immigration, pay rates, the public services. And what I would say about it being a good day for democracy is we've made these changes, but we are very ready to listen to people who have come to lobby us. I am meeting a farmer from my constituency later. They will make a case to me and I will listen to it.
All right.
But we believe that the data we have demonstrates that this will really only affect a minority of better off farmers with more expensive assets.
I know everybody...
And I think the data is very hard to argue.
All right, well, I know everybody else is dying to come in, but I'm going to actually talk to Paul Cheshire, Emeritus Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics. Welcome to you, Paul, and our guests here will be able to hear what you have to say. I hope you were listening and could hear the two farmers that were being interviewed. Do you think these changes to inheritance tax are going to lead to the downfall of British agriculture and an incentive not to farm?
Thank you for having me on. The answer to that is no. I mean, the problem is this inheritance tax relief was brought in 1984, and it turned owning agricultural land into having a license to avoid inheritance tax. Now, that led to a fourfold increase in the price of agricultural land as a result of people, very rich people who had nothing to do with farming historically in most cases, buying land simply in order to avoid inheritance tax generally. We know of the Financial Times has a report of James Dyson having bought up £500 million worth of agricultural land over the past 20 years. Now, the problem is that land is itself a part of the costs of farming. So if you push up the price of land, which the inheritance tax relief did, this actually means it's more difficult to make a better rate of return in agriculture because land is part of the costs.
Well, OK, Paul, let me get some response. Ben, you were looking sceptical then.
Well, if it's such a great policy, why did the Secretary of State for the Environment, Steve Reed, last year say that he had no intention to do and take this forwards? I think it would be a good day for democracy when the government in power actually does what it says in its manifesto, rather than changing things.
Answering the points that you've just heard from Paul Cheshire in terms of actually it is an old policy, they were exempt for a different set of reasons that have led to inflated land prices and people buying up farms to escape inheritance tax.
If that was the case, why are 10,000 people currently on Whitehall right now, like those two ladies that we heard from, desperately concerned about what's going to happen to their family farms, desperately worried about the impact on their livelihoods? This seems, I can't comment on the professor's analysis, but what I can see with my own eyes is thousands of people who are desperately concerned and upset about what the future for them and their well-being and their livelihoods is. Those people, I think we've got to listen to, and I think if they're saying it's going to affect them, it's going to affect them.
Paul, what do you say to that?
No, I don't think that's true at all. In that, people get very upset, want tariffs. We know, but tariffs do not actually help because they make things more expensive in the shops. They only help a small number of people who are involved. So it really is not the case that this is going to damage the family farmer, the would-be food producer, because one of the problems of the existing inflated price of land is that it's meant it impossible for young people who want to become food producers or farmers to actually buy land because it's too expensive. So the smaller farmer, and anyway, you can always gift your land to your children if you're worried about it. So there's no necessity for any medium-sized farmer who wants to hand on the family holding to their children and grandchildren to pay any tax at all. It's only going to affect the really rich who've been trying to avoid inheritance tax.
Well, Jess, you're here as a Liberal Democrat. The party is against this policy too. What do you say?
Absolutely.
To Paul?
And Paul is right when he says that they can gift their farm to the next generation. They absolutely can. But then they have to stay alive for 7 years. And when I sit down with farmers in my constituency that are saying, I'm not going to go out, I'm not going to go anywhere because I need to stay healthy for the next 7 years so that my children, when they lose me, don't then get this huge tax bill. Because actually, I think what we're not discussing is that like that young lady said when she was interviewed, they are asset rich, but they are cash poor. You may have a farm that is worth £10 million. Those farmers are never going to see that £10 million. That's not sitting in the bank. So if they are expected to then pay £1 million in inheritance on that, that means even if they spread it over 10 years, they've got to find an extra £100,000 every year, fair enough, tax-free, but they don't have those margins within the work that they do. So you are asking family farms to basically make no money for the next 10 years. So their response to that will be, we'll have to sell some land. And that land is not being sold to food producers. That land is being sold to companies or developers who are using it to offset their carbon. So what they then do is just rewild it. It goes to scrub. So the system just doesn't work. And this, yes, I understand there are tax loopholes. I recognise that there are rich people who have bought up land to avoid paying tax. But this policy that wasn't in the Labour manifesto is going to directly impact genuine family farms.
Yes,
Paul?
could I just gently point out that a couple with a farm worth 3.2 million would pay inheritance tax that they're able to pay off over 10 years. That would be about £80 a week extra on their bills.
And I would gently point out
I think that's affordable.
And I would gently point out that in my constituency...
Yes, Paul, respond.
Well, one of the impacts of this change will be to actually reduce the price of land. So some of these people will fall out of a liability anyway. So the people who've presently got £3.2 million worth of land will end up probably having significantly less. Remember, the introduction of this exemption increased the price of land fourfold over 20 years.
Right.
Come and tell that to my families, my farmer
and it's just
families in
picking up
Chichester.
on some of these things about fairness, about farms having been exempt, about the 10 years that you would have to pay it, and it would only be if you take it up to £3 million. Is this fair?
OK, do you know, if I wanted to get data and information on how I think agriculture is going to be impacted, how many farms are going to be impacted by this, I could go to Rachel Reeves, who said, it's about, 35%, it's barely any.
Well, she says about 500.
At which point I'd say, if it's that few, why bother? You're not even raising money for it, right? You're not even making much revenue. You should just get rid of it. Don't even bother putting it in place. Now, I think it's going to be a lot more than that, based upon what DEFRA has said. If anyone's going to have the statistics on how much farms are worth, how many are going to have to be broken down into smaller parts, how this is going to impact agriculture in this country, DEFRA would know. Now, they've come out and contradicted what Rachel Reeves has said. They weren't even told about this policy. There'd been no conversation. In fact, last year, NFU National Conference, Sir Keir Starmer said, we'll leave family farms alone once they're sold off. You can't get them back. He's lied. He's broken his promises. He's still doing it now. That's why people on Whitehall, they're not there for a jolly. They're not there because they're all being gaslit and a disillusion because Jeremy Clarkson said this is a problem. They're there because they know it and they live it.
Right. Well, on the figures, do you have a view on these figures, the dispute, Paul Cheshire? And it is a big sort of disparity between the two sets of figures. 500, the government has said, or Rachel Reeves has said will be affected. 70,000, say the National Farmers Union. Now, who's right here?
Well, first of all, I haven't done the research to tell you exactly who's right. But the other thing is that those figures are on a completely different basis. One is the annual flow of farmers owning land worth more than £3 million who die in any year. And the other is the total number of potential farmers of any age who are not necessarily going to die. And the other point, of course, is that people will make provision. They will gift their farms to their children if they're real family farmers who are wanting to pass on their land, and not companies who are shell companies who are set up in order to avoid inheritance tax.
Right,
and the other point I want to make, which is I think very important, is that more expensive land also means more intensive farming, and you're handing over the custodianship of land to faceless contractors who have no interest in wildlife or the environment at all. And one of the major problems we have with farming is an increasing pollution and loss of wildlife.
Right. Do you have a view on that, Ben?
I just find it fascinating that what's being presented, one of the benefits of this policy is that it's going to reduce land prices. I think if the Prime Minister introduced a policy that was going to reduce radically house prices, I can imagine the quantity and the size of the protest that's happening outside of Whitehall. I mean, the more I hear about this policy, the more ludicrous it becomes, sadly.
Right. The price of land has gone up fourfold, though, according to Paul Cheshire. But what do you say in response?
Well, no, I think it it looks very much as if the National Farmers Union figures, which are clearly worrying farmers, and that partly accounts for the number
Maybe they're
we're here
right.
today. No, it strongly looks as if what they've done is assume no one is a couple, and they've also significantly increased the value of the land. They've made an estimate for the value of farming land across the country, which is way too high. Welsh hill farms are being valued, ludicrous amounts of money in their figures. Therefore, increasing the numbers who they are saying are likely to be caught by the removal of APR.
But what about the DEFRA
And I think
figures?
that's
I
wrong.
would prefer
What
to
about the DEFRA
believe
figures?
civil servants in the
Indeed.
Treasury who are relatively objective than I would a lobbying group like the NFU.
Well, yeah,
But I love that, relatively objective. What do you say? You're shaking your head there, Jess.
I'm shaking my head because it's predicted that this policy will raise 500 million a year, which in terms of the overall budget is a drop in the ocean. My issue with it is, one, that the farmers were not consulted. They found out on the day of the budget. Nobody sat round the table with the NFU to actually have this conversation. They only got wind of it just the day before. And as Jim says, the suggestion that as Ben says, the suggestion that land prices are going to come down is for the birds. But I would also say the Conservatives Kemi running out and saying, I'm standing up for farmers. I can tell you now, the farming community do not feel like the Conservatives stood up for them in the last 9 years. In fact, their farming payments that they get since 2015 have reduced by 20% in real terms up to 2024, and that's House of Commons Library research.
Well, I'm going to say thank you to Paul Cheshire and also say that we can see Jeremy Clarkson there on the stage at this protest, again addressing the crowd. You saw him in the headlines at the beginning. But do you want to respond to what Jess just said about Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives coming rather late to this issue, defending farmers?
I don't recognise that at all. I think we've very much been the party of farming for since get-go. So we've done a lot to support farming over the previous administration, and I think we're seeing it right now as the main opponents. I spoke on the day of the budget regarding this policy in terms of how it was going to harm farmers.
I would have a chat with your leader then, because only last weekend she came out and was talking about a wonderful UK-US deal that would have chlorinated chicken imported into the UK, and we need
chlorinated chicken.
We're going to do it.
Here we go.
But you need to have a chat with your leader, because she's not standing up for British farmers.
And I do
at all.
think, Jo, it is worth pointing out that Jeremy Clarkson, there on stage at the moment, boasted in a Times article in 2021 that he bought his farm for £4.25 million, specifically to avoid inheritance.
But he does farm it, doesn't he?
He does farm it,
and it is a working farm. But yes, he did say that.
He's exploiting here, and what we're doing is closing it.
Well, it is about the numbers, in part, as we have been discussing. We're going to talk about energy prices. Let me just show you this BBC News headline. As the weather has turned rather cold, it's a reminder: high energy prices predicted to be the new normal. There had been hopes that the household energy bills would actually edge down in January, but actually it looks as if the latest predictions are to be believed by the energy consultancy Cornwall Insight, that actually there might be a slight rise because Ofgem will reveal the level of the sort of typical household energy bill later this week. It could go up by 1% or £19 to £1,736. Jim, do we have to get used to this being the new normal?
Well, I think there's two things going on here. I think in the medium term, we are going to see energy bills come down as we move to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, which are sold on the international market and go up and up and up.
And what's the medium term, timing-wise?
Well, just to say quickly, they go up and up and up in response to world economic conditions, which have obviously been difficult. In the medium term, setting up Great British Energy, turning ourselves into a clean energy superpower, more solar, more wind, onshore wind.
How long are people going to have to wait, though, Jim? What people want to know is when are the bills going to come down, which is what Keir Starmer said.
Home-created renewables will bring bills down because we will no longer be subject to the vagaries of the international market. We're saying that by the end of our term in office, they will have come down. And we're still very confident that that will be the case with the investments we've made. Very significant investments. More solar, for instance, approved in the last 5 months than was approved in the last 10 years of a Conservative government. We're really making progress on this, and that will bring bills down.
Alex?
Well, thank God you can have a load of farmers' fields to put the solar panels on. But look, the problem I have with this is you're right. The wholesale energy market, fossil fuels will dictate prices, whatever OPEC decides to do with barrel production, whatever Donald Trump might do in the future as president with drill, baby, drill. But what we've effectively done is in the process of detransitioning or whatever, or transitioning, we've essentially tied our hands behind our back by not having any new North Sea oil and gas drilling, right? Exploration. We're not part of that market, so we're forced to go cap in hand to Qatar at winter time and say, can we buy your LNG? And have to cope with whatever inflated price there is. If I also thought that this green revolution was actually making jobs and building investment in Britain, which is what we were all told the green revolution would do, green jobs, it's going to be great, industry leader. It's not.
All right.
Where are the turbines and solar panels coming from? We've just gone to see his mate President Xi in China. That's where they're coming from.
Well, Jim?
Let's write a big charity check to Beijing. They can put the carbon in the air. And it just doesn't make sense geopolitically even.
The very significant investments that are being made in renewables are going to generate jobs. Just last week, Keir Starmer was able to announce a new renewables factory in Hull, which will build the blades for offshore wind, creating lots more jobs in that part of the country which needs that investment, and which has actually made green energy a really big part of its offer to the UK. So that is happening. Clearly, the investment takes time to work, but I think we can already see really big movement. In the meantime, and I do think this point needs to be made, as energy bills nudge up a bit, as the Cornwall report says, there are lots of ways in which the government is intervening to try to help people.
Well, we'll come on to the way the government.
Oh,
well, I was going to say. Well, this is the
really
time to bring
that.
this in then, since Alex has said it, and that is on winter fuel payments. There may be some regret, if there wasn't at the time, in response to the decision to cut winter fuel payments for millions of pensioners. Someone who clearly doesn't like it is Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, and he has just tweeted: a Scottish Labour government will reinstate the winter fuel payment. What he is suggesting is that the eligibility criteria should change. In other words, he feels more pensioners should be able to claim winter fuel payment. Do you agree with him?
Well, one of the great things about having a devolved nation is that Scotland, Wales and other parts of the country are able to take their own decisions on this.
But is he right?
No, well, I'm just going to say one of the reasons he's able to do this is because there has been a record settlement for Scottish Government from the budget that we've just been discussing. So £1.5 billion this year, I think £3 billion in the following year.
Sure.
And he can. If he becomes First Minister,
yes.
If he isn't First Minister, his offer to the Scottish people is he would look at how we subsidise people's energy use, particularly looking at hardship.
Yes, but hang on, Joe. The question is, he obviously feels the level of pensioner credit is too low. The cliff edge is too dramatic. Is he right?
Well, that's his decision for Scotland.
No, but I'm asking what your opinion. He's made as is he right?
His decision for Scotland is that. Our decision for England.
All right, so you think he's wrong?
For England and the UK. Yeah. Is to take away that winter fuel allowance from the richest pensioners, get more people on pension credit, and also help people via the household support fund and the warm homes discount, which I think need to be remembered and understood.
All right, well, let's get back to the energy bills. Energy bills going up. Do you agree with Alex that actually the transition to the green economy is going too fast and we still need to drill more oil and gas?
No, I don't. I don't agree with that. I think if we'd have carried on the same trajectory that we had during the coalition when Ed Davey was Minister for Energy, he quadrupled our renewable energies in this country during that coalition, and then the Conservatives let that fall away when the Liberal Democrats left that coalition. If we'd continued on that trajectory, we'd now have far more renewable energies, and so we'd see a reduction in our energy bills. In the situation that we're in, actually, I think our big issue is that we're not taking business along with us, which Alex alluded to as well. There's a business in my constituency that are a green business. They have excess energy that they wanted to feed into the grid that would support the local area and be able to bring down prices. They were quoted $3 million to be able to connect up to the grid as an initial cost. That's ridiculous. If we've got green businesses that are willing to give their green energy into the grid, then we need to be focusing on that to bring prices down for customers.
Should we just get used to higher bills?
So one of the things I'm most proud of that we've achieved over the last 14 years was having such a huge amount of renewables now feeding into our grid. It's about 40% of power in the grid is coming through wind. We've got the world's biggest, second biggest, third biggest, fourth biggest so wind farms. So we've done a lot in terms of decarbonising our grid over the years. I think my 3 panel members all have some things that they've said in this round of conversations, I think have points to make. In due course, renewables are going to reduce the price. The question is how you get there and how you get there in a sustainable way. I think there's often a sort of misunderstanding about how the oil and gas market works. It's a commodities market. If we have our own domestic oil and gas production, it doesn't actually affect the price of oil and gas across the world because it's a commodity. But what it does do is it provides jobs and it provides resilience, particularly energy resilience, which is so important at the moment. So at the moment, we need gas. If you look at our grid, we need gas. It's the only thing that you can turn up very quickly when there's a spike pressure on the grid until we've transitioned to smart grids. Right. This takes money, it takes time, it takes investment. And so my question is, why was there in the Labour manifesto a commitment that energy bills would be reduced by £300? When are we going to see that? And instead what we've got is £300 being taken away from pensioners.
Jim? Well, we're very confident we can get there with the investments we're making. It does take time. Clearly, international conditions mean that sometimes there are headwinds in your efforts to reach the objective that you're trying to reach.
Yeah, but those headwinds could continue,
well,
couldn't they?
They could continue, but I think we're going to be in a much better position to get people's bills down. As Jess has said, and I think the last 14 years, certainly the first 5 years of those, there was more investment in renewable. We're picking up that and running with it and increasing the investment. I think the previous 10 years was wasted largely, and we're attempting to make sure that with things like the new solar, new wind, no onshore wind in the last 10 years, that was a terrible waste of a resource that's there and available to us. Less offshore wind, the last offshore wind auction of the Conservative government yielded no offshore wind.
Yeah, but do you regret then not investing more? I mean, at one point you were going to invest £28 billion in the sorts of technologies, renewables you're talking about, and now it's far, far less, 4 or 5.
Well, it's a much bigger investment than has been made in this country ever, in fact.
But nothing like the amount that you promised.
Well, I think if you add that up over the next 5 years, it's going to be very, very significant. It's probably going to get actually somewhere near 28 billion, in fact. So I think we're probably, having withdrawn the pledge, we're pretty close to actually meeting the kind of things we wanted to see as a result of that investment.
Well, let me just remind everybody what Ben was saying. Keir Starmer, my Labour government will tackle the root causes of the cost of living crisis and help families save up to £300 off their energy bills. Do you accept it will take time?
I know it'll take time. And that's what I'm saying. We've gone into this battle now having both hands tied behind our backs because we're not having any sort of fossil fuel production here and we've got fossil fuels, which could have helped in part to fund that transition, to give us geopolitical stability. I don't particularly want us to have to go cap in hand to ne'er-do-well states and hostile regimes every single winter to keep the lights on. And also, when you look at, for instance, when we have an energy deficit and we get what we need to get from France and that cable runs in both directions, France are in a mess as well with their nuclear power. They've lost control of Niger because the Wagner mercenaries have created a coup there. They've got no access to uranium.
But they have got nuclear, as they would say, as part of
the argument that we need to build up resilience, protect ourselves with a force field, something to fall back on, is so important. If you're going to say we're not going to invest all of this to have the green revolution tomorrow, it's going to cost a load of money, but it's here tomorrow, and instead say, well, we're not going to invest as much, we're going to take a step back. What you don't do then is go, right, no more fossil fuels at the same time, like bam. It's just, it's ideological and it's stupid.
Let's talk about the NHS. This headline in The Times. NHS will be overwhelmed unless patients look after themselves. The public must be motivated to take charge of their own health, a Labour advisor has said. Their comments from Paul Corrigan. He is an advisor to West Streeting and working to develop the 10-year plan that the government has talked about for the NHS. He also advised the last Labour government on health policy, and he was speaking at the Institute for Government think tank yesterday. Is there anything there you can't agree with, Ben?
So I think it's fair to point out that if you look at the current demographic trends in the UK, as things have been going for the past 20 or 30 years, we're seeing increasing care needs, particularly people living longer with chronic illnesses. And the way that healthcare exists has changed over the past 50 to 100 years since when the NHS was set up, particularly with things like dementia, diseases of affluence, obesity, etc. I think that the concern that I have with these ways of framing is, for me, it goes back to the core about what the NHS is there for. You know, are we here as citizens to service the NHS, or is the NHS here to help us? And I think often there can be a lot of arguments made about we need to do that and we need to do this to protect the NHS. And what I'd rather focus on is actually what can the NHS do for us, and how does public health work across the state, rather than framing everything as a sort of NHS rules all quite approach, which I think is the wrong way of doing it. The second point I'd want to make is, particularly when it comes to public health interventions, they don't necessarily save money. Yeah. They're good things to do to keep people healthy, but don't necessarily save care costs in the future.
Right, but the point is, are we going to have to do more as individuals to look after ourselves as we get older?
Well, we do, because our residents are trying to take care of their own health by trying to get a GP appointment at the source of the root cause of the problem. So they're showing up at their GP and saying, "Can you please see me? Something's not right." And we know that 25% of the people sat in A&E are there because they couldn't get a GP appointment. They don't want to be in A&E. They don't want to be contributing to the mass in secondary care. They want to be able to see their local doctor to get it addressed at source, which is why the Liberal Democrats keep coming back to this argument that if you just throw money into the centre of the NHS, it doesn't get to where it needs to go. If you imagine the NHS like an octopus, it's not getting into the right legs to be able to fix the problem. You have to fix the front door and you have to fix the back door. And my concern is this change to NICs is going to have a detrimental impact on our GP services. They are talking about pulling back. They're talking about reducing appointments. They're talking about having less doctors on shift so that they can afford to sustain themselves.
I mean, Paul Corrigan is talking about people managing their own health. So that means more technology, more prevention. Is he right in the end that as we do live longer and perhaps have more complex needs, that we as individuals will have to do more?
I just want to say about this, well done, Labour. I'm excited about this. I'm excited to see a government grasp the nettle when it comes to lifestyle medicine and people having agency over their bodies. And I'm not going to bang the drum about, oh, nanny state this. I actually want to see government standing up to the big food industry and saying what ingredients you're putting in, what advertising campaigns you're using. They're very cynical about the way they operate.
So more intervention.
One minute they're pushing low-fat products. Now we know that all the emulsifiers, extra sugars and things put in those particular products actually contributed to obesity, actually could be contributing to a huge uptick in bowel cancer in young people. We know that now they get on the whole vegan food agenda. Why? Many people find it difficult to make themselves. So ultra-processed food, here we go. Big food gets to make massive products by pretending to be virtuous.
Would you take up that mantle and intervene in that way, or certainly call for it?
Well, I think let's recognise the situation we're in. There's a massive collective challenge in taking the NHS from its worst ever crisis and sorting out waiting lists and GP appointments, all those things that Jess is saying need to happen.
Answer the question. Is he right? Is
they
he
need
right?
to happen. Once all that has happened, there is still a really big challenge for the NHS with, as Ben has said, an ageing population, but also challenges like obesity and the number of people.
Yes, but what Paul Corrigan is saying, you need to do that now. You don't wait for the sorts of things to happen that you're outlining. If we do some of the things that perhaps has been suggested by Alex and Paul Corrigan, then it won't be overwhelmed, the NHS.
Well, I think lots is happening. So on obesity, for instance, we are looking at banning junk food advertising to children, which will start, I think, to reduce the obesogenic environment that children live in. We're looking at reviewing the sugar tax so that we might get reformulation of products. It worked with sugary drinks. I think it could be extended to milky drinks. I'd personally like to see it extended to other products as well. The wider food economy that Alex has talked about.
Right.
We are also looking at trying to get the population healthier and exercising, and I think the smoking legislation is also very important. If we can get
so that's lots of government intervention. Would you support that, Ben?
So firstly, I should have said, as a former doctor, of course, I'm going to promote people taking responsibility as much as they can.
But those sorts of interventions.
For health choice. Well, I think you've got to, for all intervention, you've got to think about the impact. What are you trying to change? How do you think it's going to try and change it? And what are the knock-on effects and consequences? And I think that's one thing that we haven't seen enough of recently, which is impact assessments for all these policies that we've seen sort of thrown out. When you look at, if you look at 20 or 30 years from now, in terms of rates of people needing care, that's pretty much baked in. Yeah, because of the sort of diseases that sort of the time they take to sort of mature in terms of impacting people.
All right.
Looking at children today, when you look at things like obesity, for example, it's very linked to poverty, and that's what we need to focus on.
All right, it's all we have time for today, but thank you to all of my guests for joining me on this episode of Politics Live. I'll be back tomorrow with more and PMQs at 11:15. Bye-bye.